heavens have just opened where I sit. So if you do hear background noise, I do apologise, but I can't control the torrential rain that's occurring outside my office. However, I'm delighted that we've got a stellar cast this afternoon to look at issues around age-friendly housing, particularly within a social housing context. And it's really timely because we had the launch of the Older Persons Housing Task Force recently. Indeed, it was opened and launched at Julia's scheme that she was pivotal in seeing the development of, as it was then under Central and Cecil, but now under the Aster Group. And I'm sure Julia will draw attention a little bit more to that scheme during their presentation. But also some fascinating work that's going up and down the country. And we're going to be kicking off with something that's happening around the Greater Manchester area, and particularly work that's being led by Mark, Alan and Neve around age-friendly social housing, and thinking about the research that leads into a collaborative approach to improving the experience of the ageing. As I said, we'll then be followed by Julia Ashley, who's now the Business Development Director at the Aster Group, about her organisational approach to thinking about ageing, but also some of the sort of iconic schemes that are being developed through her programme. And talking about iconic schemes, we'll also draw attention to the work that Alison's been doing as Head of Research and Influence at United St Saviours and their latest scheme, Appleby Blue. And delighted, Alison, that you could join us. And can I also thank our sponsors, including the UKRI, United St Saviours and the Aster Group for making this session possible. But as it's tipping down here, I'm going to hopefully pass over to Mark, where it might be less background noise, although you might have a toddler or two who may make some noises. So over to you, Mark, and thanks very much for you and the team joining us.
Thank you, Jeremy. Yeah, no, there's a couple running around, but I think Postman Pat might be about to save the day and hopefully get rid of some of the background noise for us. I'll just share my screen. Wonderful. Okay, well, thank you. Great to see so many people. Great to see so many familiar faces as well. Apologies to those of you who were at the British Society of Gerontology conference this week. I know there's a few people I recognise from the list. You might be seeing some slides for the second time, but hopefully there's some new things in today as well. So yes, my name's Mark Hammond. I'm a senior lecturer in architecture at the Manchester School of Architecture. And today I'm talking about a research project which we started about 9 months ago called Co-Creating Age-Friendly Social Housing. So a bit of context won't be new to any of you, I don't think, but obviously, you know, our interest in kind of health inequalities, we know that social housing tenants have significantly worse health outcomes than the rest of the population, and often impacted by kind of conditions within their homes and neighbourhoods which negatively affect their quality of life. So our project really came from this recognition that actually a lot of registered housing providers are doing some really innovative work around older people. And our focus on this project is a number of housing providers who aren't just focusing on the home itself, but some of the wider determinants of health and well-being, including social isolation, poverty, and inequality. We've got a really big project team. So there's the School of Architecture as part of Manchester Metropolitan University, colleagues Alan, Neve and others from University of Manchester. But our project is a collaboration between 3 housing providers in Greater Manchester: Southway Homes, One Manchester and Stockport Homes. Together with the GM Aging Hub at the Combined Authority and a community interest company called Community Savers. We've been working with the Dunhill Medical Trust as our funder, who have this mission towards building, developing suitable living environments and communities for an ageing population. So really our process was to work with our 3 housing association partners to explore new ways of working around age-friendly issues. So we're interested in exploring, creating and evaluating the different ways that residents and RPs and academics can collaborate to develop age-friendly initiatives. So it's a kind of participatory action research project. So we're interested in the doing, we're interested in creating change. And across these 3 initiatives that we're working with these 3 housing providers, we're really interested in how these processes can address issues of spatial exclusion, gentrification, and some of the prejudice that older people can face in urban environments too. So just to kind of reflect on this notion of living environments, we see a lot of work, a lot of excellent work, I should add, around age-friendly homes and age-friendly neighbourhoods. But we thought there was a really interesting intermediate scale that perhaps wasn't being addressed too often in research. This scale that we're kind of dubbing the living environment. So the block, the high street, or the street even. Which we think are really important in the social bonds that people create. People's sense of identity is often tied up to these kind of smaller geographical areas rather than necessarily the whole of a city or whole of a neighborhood. And this is a scale that we think housing associations often have a really key role in determining. You know, the housing providers that we've been collaborating with are some of the larger providers who've had kind of stock transfer or working as almos, so they have a lot of properties within the defined geographical area, and as a result have a real key role in kind of placemaking and identity that we feel is a little underexplored in some of the research today. So like I said, we've got 3 projects that we're working on in Greater Manchester as part of this wider project. We're developing a naturally occurring retirement community out of an old tower block in Hume, which is something that we're going to focus on in our presentation today. But we're doing some other work with Stockport Homes in Brinnington around a kind of community space, and working with Southwark Housing Trust on a kind of socially rented co-housing scheme in Old Moat as well. However, I'm not going to touch on those too much today. The Hume one's a little bit further developed, so I think we've got more to reflect on there at this stage. So our approach to this is participatory action research. So the priorities and the plan is developed collaboratively with tenants, with the housing provider, really focusing on the precise nature of the challenges and aspirations that people have in certain locations. Each housing provider is employing a project officer to lead the work on the ground, and it's very much a kind of reflecting and learning process. And we have kind of resident co-researchers in each case study, supported by the research team and this community development charity, United St Saviours, in terms of skills and engagement. I guess the main thing with this is that the examples we've got are things that don't exist, that we feel that they're really kind of cutting edge. And you know, as we'll discuss with the example of a naturally occurring retirement community, there isn't a kind of way of doing this that is kind of on the shelf and waiting for us. So it's very much kind of doing and reflecting and a kind of practice-based approach. So today we're going to be sharing kind of findings as they are currently emerging. We're kind of 9 months into the project, but obviously we look forward to coming back later on with some more rounded reflections, perhaps. And more broadly, that I think the key part of this project is recognizing that as academics, as housing providers, as residents, we're all equally but differently expert. And actually the success of these kind of initiatives is our ability to work together and collaborate. So like I said, we're going to focus today's presentation on the work we're doing in Hume, and I'm going to pass over to Niamh now, who's going to tell you a little bit about what we're doing there and this concept of a naturally occurring retirement community.
Thank you, Mark. Yep, so a little bit of context. So Hume is an inner city area of Manchester, and as Mark has said, the focus of the case study here is on a high-rise block of flats called Hopton Court, which is owned and managed by the Housing Association One Manchester. So this is a 9-storey social housing block, and it was built in the 1960s, and despite not being designed specifically for older people, 75% of the residents of Hopton Court are aged over 50, and 96% of those are living alone. And interestingly, the block is sort of spatially nestled in between both of Manchester's universities. So it's affected by this process of studentification, as well as being affected by the more general ongoing gentrification or regeneration of Hume that's been occurring for many decades since the 1990s. And what these external processes have done have sort of engulfed taken away lots of the social infrastructure in the immediate neighbourhood for older existing residents, as well as making significant social changes in terms of the transient student population and the infrastructure that's being developed there and added there being more tailored to a sort of younger and more affluent crowd. Next slide, please. And we can just see this spatially here with the map. So the red outline is signifying Hopton Court, and the blue around it is either university buildings or halls of residence. So this just gives you some perspective just to how prevalent or sort of prominent these wider processes are, and how close Hopton Court sits to the university. And the next slide, thank you. However, at the same time as these sort of external pressures really affecting the lives of people at Hopton Court, there's this long history of community organisation and activism in Hume. And this activism of tenants has also occurred in Hopton Court very strongly, where they've mobilised around issues of ageing and inequalities. So for years, tenants have been trying to affect change in the block, and the tenants, they're a group that have always talked about maybe feeling voiceless, and a lot of the work that they've done, a lot of the campaigning that they've done has been around trying to develop a voice, and they've done this through various means. So for example, they've written, if we work from left to right on these images, they've written poetry books about the experiences of older Irish men in Manchester and Hume. They're involved in wider campaigns such as Block the Block, which is against the campaigning against the building of more student accommodation in the immediate area or right in front of Hopton Court. They've also done theatre productions around trying to give older people a voice. So they did a theatre production with a theatre in Manchester, the Royal Exchange Theatre, and the play was entitled "Can You Hear Me from Up Here?" And then the last two images are speaking to some formal reports. So this was the start of sort of Manchester University's involvement in the sort of work that the tenants at Hopton Court are doing. So the tenants developed 2 academic research reports, and the audience of these reports was just one group, which was One Manchester, who, as we know, were the housing association. So the tenants wanted to develop a different relationship with their housing provider, and they wanted to sort of lobby for more support from them. And the tenants felt like leaning on that research angle and leaning on the universities was a way of getting One Manchester around the table and having the tenants' voices valued by them. And these collaborative reports worked in that sense, in that One Manchester are now on board. And one of the key findings of these reports is that tenants wanted to develop a naturally occurring retirement community programme or NORT programme. Next slide, please. Thank you. Okay, so when we're talking about a NORT, what we're referring to is a living environment or indeed an area that contains a large number of older people. And this is a density of older people that's occurred naturally over time. And a NORT programme, therefore, is a response to that. So what a NORT programme does is leverage or capitalise on this high concentration of older adults in one place by providing a range of integrated services of health and social support that are clustered within and around the existing housing accommodation in which older people have always lived. So it's essentially a programme that is retrofit into existing accommodation rather than specialist housing being built. And NORTs are predominantly a North American model, and typically they tend to operate in sort of high-rise towers and blocks of flats, or in other words, like these high-density living environments. And it's a reason as to why it makes sense for Hopton Court. And there's no agreed upon definition of a NORT because a variety of different models exist, but NORT programs are foundationally a proactive approach to ageing and support rather than a reactive one, where these sort of networks of support are created and brought into the tower block or into the places in which older people have always lived, and they therefore help to facilitate ageing in place or ageing well in place. Next slide, please. Thank you. Okay, so there are 5 key characteristics that we'll go through quite quickly today, but just to start, an overarching concept of a NORT programme is that these programs are developed, maintained, they're created, developed and maintained through collaborative partnerships, and they involve a range of different partners or stakeholders, including sort of tenants and residents, community agencies, service providers, health services, different levels of government, property owners, and so on. So there's a variety of different partners involved, and these are all key to driving the success of the NOC, and each one has a key role to play. But most NOC programs are resident driven or tenant driven, where the residents who have lived in the community for many years play a leading role in what that NOC program is going to look like. So though their voices are sort of prioritised throughout, if you like, and this is imperative for the success of the program. So we older people, we like to say, are active contributors rather than passive recipients in the development of the programs. Then we have on-site services. So another key part of a NOC is about drawing health and social services into accommodation or into Hopton Court, let's say. So to have these on-site health and social support. So it's an inward model of support that offers these access and links to health services for older residents there. Another central feature is that NOC programs have both formal and informal elements that are key to its success. So it's not just about providing a health service on site or putting on one event, a social event in the garden, let's say, but the program should be bringing in a range of different things and creating these sort of network or infrastructure that tenants feel that they are a part of and have contributed to, which then allows different ways of interacting between them and for this trust to build up. So whilst formal care and provision of services is fundamental to the programme, it's also those more informal interactions which are key for the more well-rounded support that a NOC programme is able to offer. So in a nutshell, NOC programmes are community focused just as much as they are about simply being focused on welfare, let's say. Then sustainable funding. The funding for NOCs comes from a mix of both private and public contributions, and there's a different, each model is funded differently, but a key characteristic of a successful NOC is having a sort of long-term funding arrangement that is supporting and sustaining the programme over time. And then finally, place-based. So NOC programs are always created through a sort of place-based focus. So they emerge out of the specific aspirations and needs of the community that it's being developed in, as well as the partnerships and the context that they're working in, and the opportunities and constraints that context is offering or creating. And this is why the definitions vary, and that each model looks different on the ground and is developed in a different way, and how services, how it's decided what services matter is always developed through these collaborative partnerships on the ground. And we just want to give you a little bit of an example just to try and cement what I've been saying. So a major example of a well-established NOC program would be Penn South in New York. So this was developed in the 1980s and was New York's first NOC program ever created. So the context here is that there was high-rise towers built in Manhattan for key workers there many years ago, and residents stayed in this accommodation for years because it was so cheap. And in this sense, nobody left, and many of the residents aged in place there over time. So essentially it became a NOC. And after realising more support was needed for the high density of older adults living there as they aged, the residents worked with a social care provider to co-create an integrated care offer. So the blocks now have on-site nurses as well as social workers, and they have these sort of regular health checkups such as blood pressure clinics and so on. And then the Penn South NOC also includes a rich social program with these weekly social events and activities which are co-designed and co-delivered with the older residents that are living there. Next slide, please. However, there are some questions that we have over the way that we can develop a NOC at Hopton. So first of all, as I said earlier, NOCs are predominantly a North American model, and there are a lack of examples as to how NOCs can be developed, specifically around high-rise towers in the UK, given that the contexts are, strikingly different. So there's no one model that can easily be replicated here, and there's not so much that we can learn from in terms of how to develop the NOC at Hopton. So, for example, in American NOCs, there's a strong role of social care organisations or social services delivering and also funding the NOC programmes, whereas here, as we know in the UK, we're in an age of austerity where health and social care services are stretched beyond belief and don't have the capacity to create a programme and fund a programme. And at the same time, we have different stakeholders involved in developing the NOC at Hopton, so we don't we are maybe trying to develop these links with the health side, as Mark will speak about in a second. But, you know, we've got the Housing Association as a key role delivering the programme, so that's also a different context. And just to add, there's also hardly any insight on how NOT programmes are developed in sort of lower income and more marginalised communities, because the majority of examples that exist in America, or North America, should I say, exist in higher income areas in more affluent neighbourhoods, and they subsist maybe on generous donations from sort of private companies or from state funding, and obviously we don't have that in the UK. And finally, because there are a lack of examples in such communities, in marginalised communities, it's unclear the extent to which NOT programmes can help to address the precarity of living in such hostile inner city living environments like Hume, where existing older tenants are very much socially and economically excluded. So whilst we know that NOTs help to facilitate ageing well in place, it's unclear whether they will work in this context or whether a NOT programme will help to, say, buffer some of the effects of those external processes like gentrification, though we are hopeful that it will. So we think that trying to create a NOT at Hopton Court in this context requires new ways of working to be developed, and it's essentially what the research project is doing. And I'll hand back now to Mark, and he can tell you a little bit about that.
Great, thank you, Neve. Whoops, I went one slide too far. Is it going to let me go back? Hooray, it does. I'm just going to give you a little update on kind of what we've been doing today, to date, really, and reflect on some of the kind of key bits of learning from a couple of examples. So when the project started, we did recruit a community development worker, a kind of NORC officer, recognizing the fact we didn't really know what a NORC officer meant. It's something that we've been developing as we go through a test and learn approach. I would say something quite novel about this already, though, that the tenants of Hopton Court were involved in the recruitment process, both in drafting the job specification, but also as part of the interview process. The applicants had a session with older people where you know, we got a feel for kind of how they would interact with tenants and how they would be treated, which I think means we got a really excellent candidate. But B, I think, has brought the tenants into a process and started to break down maybe some of the barriers between housing association and resident as well. We have regular steering group meetings, which is the kind of wider stakeholder group, including residents, and the tenant group meetings. And as part of this, we have been developing links with kind of a wider set of stakeholders. So, for example, people from the local care organisation have come to one of these sessions to explore how we can work together. And issues like antisocial behaviour are a real key issue to tenants in the block. And so we've had kind of people from the police and the housing association's antisocial behaviour team coming in to do quite targeted pieces of work with the tenants. And we've had this kind of enduring weekly drop-in and increasingly kind of social activities that go along with it, as a way of really helping us and the NORC officer get to know tenants and kind of how we can be inclusive of their needs as the project progresses. But I just want to talk to three little examples. There are so many little moments in the project which I think speak to the potential of this kind of work. So I just want to share a few. So one of them is in relation to a tree planting activity. So Shakira, our kind of NORC officer in the area, got a phone call one day from a kind of community work team. So, you know, some of the contractors do like a day of volunteering, you know, with One Manchester. Basically called up saying, hi, we're going to do this tree planting initiative. Just to let you know, we're going to be showing up at 3 o'clock next week to plant a load of trees. And because Shakira is a really community-minded person who's got a real understanding of the needs of tenants, she kind of intervened immediately and put it back to them, kind of, you know, how would you feel if someone broke into your garden and planted a tree without your permission? How about we kind of put it on pause for a few weeks? I'll have a discussion with the tenants and we'll see if we can come up with a plan. So Shakira goes and she convenes a group of tenants. She says, we've got this offer of someone coming in to plant some trees. What do we actually want to see? you know, where do or don't we want these trees planted? And it became this really creative process where, you know, they've decided that they want these Aspelia fruit trees on one of the boundary walls, so it kind of blocks out the view of traffic. They wanted, you know, some planting in different places. It started a discussion about setting up a herb garden. And suddenly this activity, which was, you know, could have really been a doing to, it's something that, you know, the housing association more broadly was doing to the tenants, became something they were doing with, and it became something that the tenants were able to own. So not only is that a really good kind of well-being factor and kind of gives the tenants this ownership over their space and is part of this process of aging in place, but frankly, it also means the trees are going to get looked after because, you know, they're planted in the summer, they need watering 3 times a week. And if the tenants aren't doing it, the trees are going to die. So they've got a real ownership over their garden space, and are kind of happy to do this. So this feels like a really tiny thing. It's, you know, just one member of a team questioning a process and thinking, does this do right by the tenants who live here? But it was able to really affect a really positive change. So another example was kind of a recognition within the project that, you know, as with a lot of projects, you end up speaking to a lot of the same people who are willing and able to be engaged. But there was a real desire amongst everyone to widen and broaden participation. So the tenants suggested, you know, as the weather was getting a bit nicer, maybe we could do a barbecue activity. So it was kind of proposed and co-developed between the tenants and Shakira. You know, 4 of the residents did all the cooking for everybody else. But I think a key thing here is how this place-based focus has enabled different forms of engagement to happen. So because it's a really small block and you know, Shakira and the tenants have a really strong understanding of literally every person living there, we're able to tailor the engagement process in a way that perhaps you couldn't through a process which was kind of abstractly inclusive. So they were able to literally go and knock on loads of people's doors and tell them about the event, be able to put a face to a name, be able to explain what might happen and kind of break down some of those barriers in a really immediate sense. But I think one of the really clever things they decided to do was as they were doing this door knocking, they invited everyone to suggest a couple of songs for the playlist. So this feels like a really tiny thing, you know, where it just, you know, gives a couple of songs, we'll add it to the playlist, but it's something which, you know, it builds a rapport between people. It's breaking down some of these barriers to engagement. It's something which is quick and it's free, but, you know, is potentially really meaningful for some people. And again, I think it comes down to, you know, having someone in post who's able to really recognize, you know, their potential to generate transformative relationships by kind of, you know, getting to know people there and building those relationships. And we were really pleased that, you know, despite, you know, some really complex needs of people in the block, that would mean that this kind of event isn't inclusive to everyone by its very nature. We were able to get almost half of the people living in the block down to this event about a month ago. You know, it's never enough, and we've already got plans in place for the next activity and how that can be more inclusive. But I think it speaks to the effort that you can make when you're doing something which is really kind of community focused. Okay, and one final example is around a community space. So, you know, as Neve's highlighted, there is this lack of social infrastructure in around the neighbourhood. I know all too well working there that, you know, you can't get lunch for less than, you know, £8 around the university anymore. You know, you can't find a coffee for less than £3.50. So kind of where do tenants go to interact? Where do they come together? Well, we know at the moment that in the summer, they often do it on a bench outside in the garden. But in winter, you know, we see, and we've had reports from people that the social activities really start to slow down. You know, there are community centres not not huge distances away, but again, the needs of the tenants here and their kind of ability to move around is often quite limited. And, you know, even the, 500-metre walk to the community centre down the road is enough of a barrier to prevent a lot of people from engaging. So the tenants came together and started, proposing this idea of having their own community space, and they kind of worked on this design process for this kind of hub in the garden that they wanted to call their own. for the housing association, that wasn't really something that they could support. It was kind of outside of you know, the financial reality that they lived in. However, the RP, you know, did make this amazing commitment to convert one of the ground floor flats in the tower block into a community space. You know, it's something that's, I think, it's really, you know, it solves so many issues that the tenants are facing. But I think where it is it's a really tangible example of the trust that the housing association has on with their tenants. Which, you know, with these projects, as I'm going to talk about, there are a number of challenges in terms of, you know, these working relationships and the power dynamics between people. But, you know, having the housing association be able to come back to the tenants with this proposal of converting a ground floor flat into their space is something which we know feels like has really changed the mood within the building, and, you know, really made things a lot more positive for people. The process of this is ongoing in terms of kind of what the space, you know, looks like, but also kind of what the tenant management you know, context is for it. But yeah, this feels like you know, something that's really pushed on what the NORC is doing here at Hopton. And again, this is something that's really common in a lot of the American examples, that, you know, there is a determined space. And you know, I'm sure there'll be people in the audience, I think Maria was on the list, you know, things like co-housing, and, you know, this is essentially the common house for the tenants here, is a really exciting kind of development. So some reflections on this and the other case studies as well, really, so far, is that, you know, like we've identified, a lot of this is about building relationships, which, you know, to be frank, has been really challenging. You know, we've got tenants living through kind of a cost of living crisis in really difficult circumstances. We've got housing associations who, again, are going through a huge amount of change with a lot of different pressures, and sometimes aging might feel kind of low down people's priority lists. But I think we've able to kind of come through a process of kind of developing transparency about motives, expectations, capabilities, how long things take, and the process that things go by, which is going to be really fruitful to the long-term benefit of the work we have here. You know, to reflect at the start of the project, you know, on all sides, I think there was a tendency to maybe kind of keep ideas close to our chest, or you know, maybe say yes to things because it got us out of a meeting that was quite contentious. But that only led to disappointment down the road. We had a really amazing meeting not long ago where, you know, one of the directors of One Manchester, you know, came in and basically she, you know, was really clear about the process that would need to go to affect change, you know, what she needed to do, the sign off she needed, how long things were going to take her to do. And the tenants had no problem with this because it was out in the open and they understood the timeframes we were talking about. You know, some of these problems, when you share some of these problems about, you know, different expectations or different kind of processes we need to go through, it enables all the parties to work together on solving them. And that's the kind of transformative element here. As part of this, you know, I think it's really important to recognize some of the power imbalance within this situation. You know, as much as a housing association can call the people they work with customers, you know, certainly the tenants that we speak to, you know, often feel that they aren't respected, or that, you know, they are paying money to somebody, and that there's a kind of, you know, implication there that I don't want to cause too much of a fuss because that can make my life really difficult. Now, we've not really seen examples of that, obviously, on the ground in terms of the work we do. We've not seen any of the housing associations hold that over the tenants, but certainly that kind of feeling of that power is really key in some of these relationships and needs to be addressed. But within this, I think there's this conflict between some of the roles we're talking about. You know, on one hand, a social provider is a landlord who, you know, takes money from people in order to give them a home to live in. But on other respects, you know, we're talking about a housing association having this role in supporting a community in different ways. And, you know, we've had conversations with tenants who've said, well, you know, this community space or this barbecue is all well and good, but I've got a dripping tap upstairs that hasn't been fixed for a week. So there is a real tension here that you know is still kind of looming over the work, and that we're kind of is going to be on our agenda, obviously, to try and address as we move forward. But critically, in terms of these working relationships and these power dynamics, it's recognizing that, you know, all of the environments that we create for people to work in have always got a kind of, you know, have naturally got various biases. So, you know, for example, this is a quote from one of the tenants at one of the steering group meetings, saying, "I'm always being asked to learn a new language, a new way of thinking." You know, she was on a table surrounded by various people with lanyards in a meeting with minutes and agendas and flip charts. And, you know, I think recognizing that that's a very particular way of working, which, you know, isn't particularly inclusive. So, but perhaps aligns to how certain organizations, including us as academics, you know, potentially see things as legitimate or rigorous. A really key aspect of this work, we feel, is developing these new and shared forms of legitimacy and rigor that mean we are creating this inclusive environment for people to make meaningful participations. But that doesn't mean bringing residents closer to us. It's about finding this middle ground of the Venn diagram where everyone is able to be themselves and everyone can be transparent about kind of what they're looking to achieve. And kind of finally, I think one of the things that's really kind of come to the fore is the importance of staff. You know, we feel that we're hugely fortunate in One Manchester to have Shakira working with us, because interestingly, she comes from a community development background but hasn't worked with older people necessarily before. So she's brought in a load of new ideas to her work. But, you know, these genuine collaborations do create uncertainty. We often don't know the answer. Sometimes it can feel like perhaps individually you're not in control. And if you're in a workplace situation, feeling you're not in control can be really scary. But when you've got really well-trained staff who've got these high level of skills, who are able to kind of work with different stakeholders on a really human level, it feels like we're able to achieve an awful lot. We've talked about integration with kind of public health a little bit. You know, we've discovered there is this real desire to engage in the local care organisation. You know, see what we're doing as an open door. You know, we've got this place-based thing that they can, you know, the tenants are opening the door to them. But it is unclear, like Neil said, what it's going to look like on the ground still, and how to negotiate some of the kind of difficult logistics of how we can bring services into the block. And finally, this issue of funding and sustainability and staff retention is something which is all too immediate to all of us, not least because we're on a kind of 30-month research project. We know from talking to tenants, there is this kind of disappointment and, you know, this horizon to the project for them where, you know, they lose a member of staff who develops these really strong links. And for them, it's a lot of effort to build that back up again. So this kind of work is really reliant on, you know, not just kind of individual members of staff, perhaps, you know, being supported to kind of remain in roles through the kind of funding that's available or support they get, you know, within organizations. But also I think how an institutional memory is able to develop around this kind of work as well, that it doesn't feel like whatever the next piece of work is starting from scratch. So on that point, the project does continue for, you know, another, goodness, what's that, 18 months or so now. We've got some steps at the end, which we're going to hopefully be able to share with you. There will be a publication designed specifically for registered providers, which perhaps reflects on this process and the process in the other sites about new forms of practice around kind of age-friendly living environments. We're going to be supporting this through a couple of workshops in London and Manchester in 2025. So hopefully look forward to seeing some of you there. And obviously we'll be thrilled to come back to a future HousingLIN event and update you on how this work has developed close to the time. So that's it from me, really. You know, obviously I should have added earlier, we recognize we're talking about the role of RPs in a kind of non-developmental capacity. And we do obviously value the work registered providers have in creating new housing. And I'm really excited to see the next two presentations, which will touch on that. But we do think there is this really interesting role that RPs have in communities, and are uniquely placed in communities to have, really. But there is this opportunity to think about new ways of working and what that relationship looks like, which I think is going to be really key in determining, you know, how age-friendly these living environments we're creating are. If you'd like to contact me or send me an email, please do so. Our website is at the link above. I'm sure these slides will be shared to you as well. And thank you so much for your time today, and look forward to answering some of your questions later on in the session.
Oh, Mark, Neve, and Alan, I don't think, Alan, you've said much, but we'll come back to you, I know, for sure. And I'm also conscious that what you've been sharing with us this afternoon, actually, there's so much overlap with what Julia and Alison's are going to talk about, especially that playstation, working in those communities. I know, Julia, you've got to shoot off soonish, so I'm going to immediately go to you rather than give you a big introduction. But Julia needs no introduction. She knows, she's very familiar with the LIN and well known to us all. So, Julia, over to you.
Thanks, Jeremy, and thanks, Mark, for your presentation. It was really, really fascinating, and hopefully, I can do something that can complement that as we go forward. So, right, can everybody see that? Okay. Right, I'm taking it you can, otherwise you're going to shout at me. And so here we go. So my name's Julia Ashley. I work for the Aster Group, which is, some of you may be familiar with, but has undergone some quite significant change in the last couple of years. So the Aster Group is based across the south of England, and has been a fairly large 36,000 or so general needs housing provider, including shared ownership, but more latterly has brought new organisations into the group, which has given it a real focus on its specialisms around ageing, around disability, around employment, accessibility, etc. So I was just going to take you through some of the things and over the last couple of years, these organisations coming into the group have enabled the group to kind of really step back and focus on its strategy to meet the needs of changing community demographic over the next following years. And through quite turbulent times, I agree, this is a chance for the housing sector to really step back, rethink and reimagine what its services can do and actually what its purposes and communities are. So through that group, we've engaged many people across all of those different organisations to tell us what they thought was needed in our new strategic plan, which started out as a strategic plan for ageing, but quickly became a strategic plan to support independence of our communities in the broadest possible sense. And with one organisation coming in, Trust, which has a really big focus on disability, we've brought those things together. And whilst those groups might need slightly different things, the principles of what those two groups need are exactly the same, and particularly being vibrant members of a really accessible and inclusive community, which formed the bedrock of our strategy. We wanted to co-create that strategy as much as possible. And what was really interesting, through really different demographic groups and really different types of people living in different types of accommodation, so general needs, specialist accommodation, residential care, all those groups, we expected to say something different, and different geographical locations as well, from very rural, sort of very rural West Country right through to urban London. And you know what? They all said exactly the same thing about what they wanted, which was a bit of a relief, really. Those things actually coincided with the World Health Organization's age-friendly community movement almost exactly. So there was actually no surprises. It made, if you like, putting a strategy together relatively easily, but that strategy actually is massively challenging and made us have to really rethink some of the principles that we have as specialists in our field that have been working in our sector for a long time. one of which was the concept of specialist housing versus just accessible housing for everybody. And I'm really excited by this. There's always a place for accessible housing, but as I've been listening to the previous presenter talking about naturally occurring retirement communities, it made me think about some of the places I've seen with my own eyes in the sector of extra care housing, which have purposely been designed to be inclusive retirement communities, but have actually become exactly the opposite. They're almost unnaturally unoccurring retirement communities because there's vast areas of communal space that isn't still used. And I think that's a really interesting thing for us to think about moving forward. We're still kind of very committed to providing specialist accommodation, but the really exciting thing for me is to try and make everything that we build and do accessible for everybody. And if it's accessible for aging, if it's accessible for disabilities, it's great for people, young families with children. It's great for people who are moving home. All the features that go into making a really well-designed, accessible house can be invisible, and they just brilliant design for everybody. So for me, that's really, really exciting. We're really keen to be catalysts for integration between housing, health, and care and well-being. And that's challenging, as we all know on this call. For some reason, housing seems to be not part of those discussions. So I have to figure out how we really make that part. And I could talk about this for ages, but I'm not going to because we're limited for time. Accessibility comes into tenure options and access to housing. I'm going to talk about Grace House in a minute, which Jeremy made reference to. Grace House is a really special scheme right in the heart of one of the most affluent areas in London, St John's Wood. I'm actually sat here, I've been here today, I'm actually sat in Grace House as we speak. And it's a fantastic place. I'll talk about it in a minute, but actually accessibility means being able to live in some of these affluent communities in the right tenure for you. So we've got to think really broadly when it comes to accessibility. It's not just about the bricks and mortar. It's not just about accessible comms. It's about everything that we offer and everything that we do. And then it's good for everybody. But we still have lots and lots of housing stock, as do all housing associations, that's been built over the last goodness knows how long, centuries even, and certainly decades. And a lot of that is maybe not that accessible. So there's a really strong strand in here about how we can incrementally improve accessibility of everything that we do moving forward. Another really important part of accessibility is about digital inclusion. The precursor to that is connectivity. Now, some of us take that for granted, but we know in some parts of the UK that isn't available, not consistently or reliable. It's not fast enough. So when we're talking about accessible kind of self-care, self-reporting, self-monitoring, digital healthcare, digital social care, actually, if you haven't got a connection, all of that is not available to you, and we don't get the accessible kind of inclusive environment that we want. So that's a big piece of work, I think, particularly in some of the rural areas that Aster occupies. Once we've got the connectivity, we can really provide the right technologies at the right time, backed with intelligent data gathering and sources, of course, AI and things like that can really help us provide targeted services to the right people at the right time. We take as read accessible communications and engagement, but actually we have to work hard at that. We can't ever think that we've cracked that. We've got to just keep moving on and challenging ourselves. And our strategy also covers accessible employment, and certainly Enham Trust coming into the group has brought massive opportunities around employment opportunities. And we also in our strategy very much wanting to provide accessible employment for people as they age. I said I'd talk a little bit about Grace House. You can actually go on to the case study. I put a link in there. Sally, I don't know if you could drop it in the chat as well, where you'll get all the details of the scheme. But Grace House was a regeneration of a very old, unfit for purpose, mostly studio apartments, sheltered housing block in Westminster. If you know Lord's Cricket Ground, you might. We're right opposite. So it was a very desirable site that many developers wanted to get their hands on, and challenged us very hard about why we would want to put social housing back on that site. We felt very strongly about accessibility of social housing in very wealthy areas, and really dug our heels in on that. So we have regenerated the scheme. We've split the land. We sold part of it to generate a land value that would fund a really a scheme that I'm really proud of, actually. And we were talking about design earlier in the earlier presentation about naturally occurring design. We actually worked really hard to make sure that we took away barriers for socialisation. And what was lovely to come in some probably 9-10 months after the scheme was opened, to find that the whole communal space was just full of people wandering around, milling around, hanging out, and interacting with each other. Now, we deliberately designed that, but you never know if it's going to work, do you? I think really looking at what was happening today, what I saw was that there was we designed it with no threshold, so that people didn't have to go through a door into a communal space, which can cause massive anxiety if there's nobody in there, if there's just a couple of people in there, or if there's something big going on. All of those can feel really daunting to somebody who maybe feels a bit isolated and lonely. Actually, if you take away all those barriers, there's no threshold. It's quite easy to sit down and get involved. And I was really so pleased to see that working today. Grace House has an adaptable building design, so who knows what people will need in the future, but the whole building can adapt to different needs. The apartments can be changed to change shape, and in clusters we can convert housing back into residential care if that's what people want in the future. We wanted to make sure that this building was fully accessible, but really adaptable as well. I'll come on to some of the things that we did through co-production, but very much around level access thresholds. We found a solution for motorised scooters. It's no good if, what we've got generally is fire regulations, for good reason, that prevent people taking their motorised scooter to their apartment. Now, Grace House is 170 apartments over 14 floors. If you really need a motorised scooter to get around, or wheelchair, you're not going to be able to leave that in the basement and walk to your flat. So we wanted to make sure that in some of the flats there was provision to take a motorised scooter. We actually found a solution where we have a fireproof box basically in the flat, which can enable scooter charging in flat, which meant that scheme can be completely accessible to people. Being able to orientate around a big building was really important. Having toilets near communal spaces, absolutely vital for people who are anxious about getting out and about in their community. The diversity of the scheme is one of the most diverse areas I think I've potentially worked. There's people from all walks of life in all parts of the world in this scheme, and trying to co-design with residents a scheme that worked for everybody was really, really fantastic and inspirational. And most of all, this scheme where communities can come together or be in their own flats on their own. I'm conscious of time. The huge amount of effort went into co-producing this new scheme. We already had, because it was a regeneration project, we already had the residents that were going to move back, who could be our design team, and they absolutely were the design team alongside all the professional team, working as equals, being able to define how the building should feel, the residents came up with this word of elegance. They wanted it to feel good. And actually that was such a big thing to achieve, as people had very low aspirations. They didn't think they deserved it. It's been wonderful in one of the videos when people have moved back, some of the language that people have used. One resident saying, particularly that sticks in my mind, she said, coming back here in this environment makes us feel wanted, it makes us feel important. Well, aren't they precepts to feeling part of an accessible community where you are valued, trusted, and really kind of embraced as being a really valuable member of the community? It's great to feel that people actually feel that moving back in. Residents were involved in decision making all the way through, right from concept, exploring options, right through to open the scheme back up again. And here's just some images. And a lot of that, do you know what, that was just low tech, putting tape on the floor, hanging paper from the ceiling to try and figure out what spaces felt like, going out and about in the community to see other public spaces, you know, problem solving together in the pub because that made people feel comfortable. All of those things just helped us to really get to the trust, which created the value, and I think has managed to give us some really good outcomes. Oh, come on, slides. Just really lastly, I think as part of all of this, any of us that are involved in trying to move this whole movement forward around accessible, age, disability-friendly communities where everybody could live anywhere and have their needs met in a really kind of community way. Let's try and influence as much as we can. If you want to talk to me about any of these things, please do get in touch. Grace House, as Jeremy said at the beginning, hosted the inaugural Older People's Housing Task Force meeting, and we're going to be doing a piece of work, case study around barriers to development of really inspired housing for the task group. I'm part of that National Housing Federation Older People's Housing Group. We've got technology, we've got development as themes of our work. If you want to help influence that, please get in touch. Also on the steering board for HAPPI, which is a really important part of us being able to provide really accessible options for people, both in specialist housing and in their own homes, to give people a really good, the most independent life possible in their own home. And we're also providing a platform for social entrepreneurs. Check Simply Care out. Really, really fantastic work that they're doing at the moment. I'm going to stop it there because I am really conscious of time, but thank you for listening. And yeah, I look forward to the next presentation.
Julia, thank you. And I know you've got a dash as well, but thanks for following on from Mark and the team. And it really flowed really neatly. And I think you also then put it back to that national context that I set out. So thanks ever so. And a safe journey onwards for you. And I'll see you on the HAPPI journey soon too. But you also talked about sort of thinking about the relationship with those sort of the housing in that local community, engaging with that community. And this is something I've been privileged to watch Alison do with the team at United St Saviours over the years. And we're also working with Dunhill Medical Trust in another project as well, which is highly relevant. So Alison, I'm going to ask you if you could share your screen and rather me do the talking, invite you to do some.
Thanks, Jeremy. There you go. Great. Well, thank you so much. I've always learned so much from these HAPPI hours, so it's really a privilege to be here today and share the Appleby Blue story to such an engaged group. So United St Saviours Charity has been around for a while. We were established in 1541, so we've been in Southwark addressing the needs of residents for over 500 years. Over that time, we have gathered a portfolio of investment properties, the income of which goes towards our community investment program. So we support charities and organizations doing work in the borough. And then we also have 3 almshouses. So we provide housing to older people in financial and housing need. And then we have our research and influencing activities. So in line with the World Health Organization age-friendly network, just for the time that we have today, I'm going to focus on 3 aspects. So one, how we've focused in embedding age-friendly into the built environment, and then how we have focused on our community and support service provision with age-friendliness in mind, and then lastly, about our partnerships and collaborations. So last week we had our Appleby Blue team staff training, and images say more than 1,000 words. So you have to excuse my amateur camera work, but I had to take videos for you to see this whole journey. So my sound is not working, but I'll talk you through it. So Appleby Blue is on Southwark Park Road, which is in Bermondsey, South London. It's been designed by Witherford, Watson and Mann architects, and this is the community centre. So you can see there's a double volume glazing, which is creating visibility from the street. This is the Appleby Blue Community Kitchen. This will be an integral part of our research projects. And then the mezzanine level, residents can see the activities happening down below. And then further along is communal spaces, but this is the resident-only lounge. And again, they've got a perspective down into the community centre. This all looks in on a communal courtyard, which is for everyone to enjoy, and a lot of attention to detail for the planting and the green spaces in the building. The design has taken the traditional almshouse design, so it enables social interaction. Residents can look in on one another. Crucially, there's like a threshold of sociability, so these are accessible only to the residents. This is a wheelchair accessible flat. And next year, I look forward to showing you images of it being someone's home. We're in the process of moving residents in, and that will be about an 11-week process. So beautiful natural light, high spec quality. We really believe that good design should be available to all. And then this courtyard overlooks the rooftop resident-only garden, and then a view over the London landscape. So it's a really exciting project for us, a project that we've been working on for many, many years. And I did talk about this through the video, but again, we really do believe that good design is available to all. And this has been kind of the ethos of Appleby Blue. We also feel that people in social housing are often pushed out of the communities that they live in, out of the city centre. So we're really wanting to enable social housing residents to remain in the city and the community that they love. And again, that it's not a retreat from society, that there's visibility between the residents in the almshouse and the busy street, but again, that the residents can decide their level of sociability. There are like a cascading level where they can decide to be involved or not be involved. And then the benefits of green spaces. So one is that communal courtyard, but then also the rooftop garden. So the other aspect that we bring in age-friendly practices into our work is through the community and support service provision that we provide. So I'm really proud of our resident support model. We've got a great resident support team. They work across the organization. Like I mentioned, we've got a recently recruited Appleby Blue team, which have all the staff members have a diversity of experience. They support residents with benefits, guidance, and then what we have found is that we are independent living, but we definitely provide a high degree of support. So we're a liaison between social services. We really manage a hospital discharge and helping residents and their family members through the care package that they may have. We're going to be implementing Outcome Star, As a learning organisation, we're wanting to learn from and monitor the work that we're doing with our residents, and we're going to be starting the training programme in the coming weeks. Another aspect is social participation. So again, this is around the community spaces available in Appleby Blue. We really want a sheltered housing development to be an asset to the wider community. And we're going to have an array of activities in the Appleby Blue Community Centre and kitchen. I think what really holds us in good stead with this initiative is our relationships, because we're so established in the community and we have such good relationships with charities and other organizations doing such amazing work. We're almost going to be the host of amazing work that organizations are already doing, from digital literacy to physical activity to walking tours. And then the community spaces are going to be available to the wider community. We want to encourage intergenerational engagement, and our aim is for an age diverse environment. There'll also be opportunities for residents to volunteer. And as I mentioned, the community kitchen is going to be the venue for our Bournemouth University project, which is a community-based food model project, which will be food growing, food cooking, and food sharing between our residents and local community members. But it's important to remember that we are co-producing this program. So although we've got kind of tent poles of activities, we really want to make sure that the program will organically grow through this co-production with our residents. The other aspect of our golden thread of age-friendly thinking is through our partnerships and collaboration. So we are a small housing provider, and we do have aspirations to increase our housing provision, but we believe that through our network and strong working relationships, we can think more strategically and creatively about future housing provision for older people. So we've partnered with HousingLIN, University of Stirling, Dunhill, Skye for the Serious Game. And we're going to be hosting a series of games and workshops in October so that we can creatively bring these stakeholders together in housing, health and social care to develop a local housing plan and have fun at the same time. The other area that we're really encouraged by is that Southwark Council has signed up to be an age-friendly borough. So we're working closely with our colleagues at the council to reignite this important initiative. And our team will become more involved with the Centre for Ageing Better's age-friendly network. So in closing, our aim is for the physical design of Appleby Blue to be age-friendly, for Appleby Blue to be the heart of the community, which is age diverse and inclusive, and that our strategic and influencing work with partners is to create age-friendly communities and environments. Because as Julia was saying, an age-friendly environment is an environment that works for everyone. We are definitely a learning organization and keen to have conversations to explore how we can learn and work together. So please do get in contact, and I look forward to our conversation. Thanks, Jeremy.
Alison, that was great, and I hope you don't mind that we've run over slightly, but I think the richness of the presentations mean that we've all got a lot from each other's presentation, and I hope those people who are still with us agree. Thanks also for those of you who've managed to answer some of the questions in the Q&A box, and I know other people have put very positive comments in the chat box as well, so do have a look at those. We've got a few minutes left, and I'm just going to go through some of the questions that are in the chat, in the Q&A box. Most of them have, well, all of them have been answered, but I was just wondering whether we can build on any of those. And so, for example, I know that we were looking at issues, for example, that Bob raised around how to ensure that the Norks are welcoming to all communities. But I'm just wondering whether you could sort of just reflect on that again, Mark and colleagues.
Yeah, certainly. Well, one of the things that, you know, Hopton itself is an incredibly diverse community. people living there. One of the things we're quite conscious about in the project is that there is this natural kind of clustering that goes on, and we're not naive to the the histories of the place and the kind of people politics that perhaps underpins kind of how it operates. The gossip you hear when such and such is always on the committee, such and such is, and kind of how those kind of different collectives within the community kind of emerge, and the fact there are people who perhaps sit outside of all of them, and we need to find a way of engaging them. I think the benefit has been with someone like Shakira, and the scale that we're working at here is the ability to really get into those details. It's really exciting to, we have a conversation with her and she knows if I want to, approach that group or those people or that person, that there's a way of doing so. She understands how they best react to some of those kind of inputs, which again is a huge asset to the work we're doing there. And I think has made what we're doing inclusive. But I think the next step really is in terms of the delivery and what goes on, how that can be tailored to allowing everyone to get something out of the process rather than creating a kind of generic kind of midpoint which actually doesn't address the needs of some specific groups.
Any other further comments from Alan or Niamh or Alison indeed? No? I mean, just to move on to the, sorry, yeah.
Yeah, can I just add to what Mark was saying? There's also a question which I think is quite similar from Julian Brewer about age segregation. And I think Hopton Court's really interesting from that point of view, because the origins of this project were around the way in which you had this Hopton Court that was surrounded by university buildings. You had this process of studentification where you had lots of student housing in the area. And so actually one of the things that generated interest initially in the idea of creating a NORC was the sense of a group of people who felt kind of a bit kind of abandoned and neglected in some ways, rightly or wrongly. That's kind of how they felt about it, precisely because they were surrounded by this kind of group of younger people. But I still think it then leaves that kind of open question about, what then happens going forwards? What do you then create a sort of ghetto by creating this kind of naturally working with the idea of a naturally occurring retirement community? So yeah, there's a curious tension there.
Yeah, and I think what I was struck by all the presentations was the balance between a naturally occurring retirement community, which could be vertical or horizontal, but also the approach that I think each of you sort of drew on, looking more broadly around age friendliness and naturally occurring communities in a wider mainstream housing, as well as particular purpose-built housing for older adults. And I know that some of the early work around NORCs from America that I'm familiar with talked about, particularly around the mainstream, is where there were over 35% of population which were over 65. But I think Niamh, you were talking about schemes where there's 95% schemes which had sort of tended to age in place, and as a result those had become sort of naturally occurring by virtue of the fact that those tower blocks or indeed other sort of community settings were now preoccupied by people in later life. And indeed, almshouse is a good example of that, and the work of your work, Alison. Okay, let's move on. Ali raised a very practical question. She's based in Dorset. Can she get involved? I think Mark, you said happy to have a discussion, but I know Aster Group operate throughout Dorset as well. So please do get back in touch with Julia and the team there about how you want to engage and opportunities for engaging within that county as well. I'm conscious that we've gone through quite a lot of questions. Thanks ever so much for everybody for answering them. Are there any final comments from the questions that any of you want to just pick out rather than me sort of pinpointing one or two?
I think the sustainability one is a really interesting question, because as soon as the project started, it was on the top of our list of things that we were kind of really aware of. We recognize we're part of the problem, in that the problem is there's always a pilot, there's always someone having an attempt, and there's never that long-term sustainable kind of financial settlement to support these things. One of the things with Hopton that I think is really interesting is when they actually started, before they arrived at a NORC, they were lobbying for, can we be classified as an extra care scheme so we can access funding for things like independent kind of living workers and things like that, which kind of very quickly a lot of people said that's not how this works. But their response is, well, why not? we're living in a building, we've got as high or higher level of need than a lot of specialist housing providers. How come by virtue of some kind of bureaucratic reason we don't have that level of support here? It opened a really interesting can of worms, which we've not quite got to the bottom of, but I think there is something that I think this project can speak to in terms of kind of what that could look like, because, you know, someone ends up paying for this eventually at some point in the system, and it's just really interesting to unpick kind of where that happens and if there's a better way of doing it, which is, you know, gives people a lot more kind of dignity and a higher quality of life.
Yeah, that raises some really interesting questions, and also the link in with, especially where there's increased caring needs, about the role of domiciliary care within those settings and the housing operators, intensive housing management services. And perhaps there is a conversation and negotiation to be had around the type of well-being service that could be offered in those localities, either from a self-funded basis right through to a planned or commissioned basis. But perhaps that's something we can explore from a future happy hour, as you said in your presentation. I'm also conscious that, you know, Birmingham City Council, Newcastle City Council, and other mainly urban areas have done a lot of work to look at remodelling, reinventing some of their high-rise vertical blocks, both for older adults, but also to think about them for all ages as well. So, Alan, I know you and I have done some work around some of the property and asset management stuff in previous years as well. Perhaps that's again something we can come back to, unless you have any particular thoughts around the build quality now. No,
that's not for today.
Okay.
Jeremy, can I just pick up on your comment about the well-being services? And I think that's why we were so keen to be involved in the Serious Game. It's although we do not provide care per se, we are very conscious that the service that we provide enable our residents to live in their home for as long as possible. And it's about having those conversations with the health and social care team, and that's not just local authority, that's also the voluntary sector, to think more outside of the box in how we work together to address these needs.
Well, Alison, I could not agree with you more, but also it's as if I set you up, or you set me up perfectly, because our final happy hour of this series in 2 weeks' time is looking at issues relating to horizontal integration of health and housing as opposed to vertical integration within the health system itself. So that's something we will be looking at both from a public health perspective, but also drawing on the lived experiences of people, as well as how system change is taking place. And what we've heard this afternoon is examples of that sort of already happening, and it's been a real privilege to listen to all of you, to share your learning, your expertise, research, and what's actually happening on the ground. So can I just, on behalf of the HousingLIN, thank all of you who've been able to speak this afternoon, and Julie, I know she's shot off already. Can I thank everybody for their questions and the chat in the box? Can I also thank the team behind the scenes, Sally, for all your assistance in putting on this, and please do join us for our final happy hour of our summer session in a fortnight's time, and I wish you